All right, hello everybody. My name's Tom Davis, and I am pleased to bring you the latest Battleshopper breakdown here with a Blood Wild Deathcry deck. Now, this is my first Battleshopper breakdown for Battleshopper.com, and I am thrilled to be part of the team bringing you some awesome Hex content, hopefully weekly. And we're going to start off with, again, Blood Wild Deathcry. Now, a lot of speculation has been going around in the current standard format that mid-range decks have kind of fallen off the radar. Now, it's true that aggro decks make up a very large portion of the standard metagame, whether it be with Ruby deck wins or Redlings, mainly because of the raw power of Lasgar's Vengeance. On the flip side of that, we also have a very powerful Diamond Sapphire control deck that aims to use like room binds and transmogger fades and other control style effects to to eventually get the opponent to Psychic Ascension so they can ascend to a Paragon of Thought and take over the game that way. Now, I wanted to bring mid-range decks back into the spotlight here because I feel like while they're kind of in an awkward spot, I feel like they can be used successfully still in standard. And I feel like there's a very good place for them in the metagame. So this week I'm going over a mid-range deck that kind of abuses the Deathcry ability in Hex. The ability that says when a creature goes into a crypt, do something. So this is the exact 75 cards that Hex player IceCon used to top 8 the most recent Hex Bash, and that is again a $1,000 cash tournament that Hex holds every weekend. So I definitely encourage you to play one of the Hex Bashes if you like standard. But we're going to start off with the champion in Takahiro. Now, Takahiro works very well with the Deathcry deck because, well, you get to sacrifice creatures to gain life and draw a card. And the majority of the creatures in our deck aim to aid in that purpose. So beyond Takahiro, we have the so-called engine to the deck. And when I say engine, I mean the two core cards that really get the deck going. And I'm going to start with Lord Blightbark. Lord Blightbark is a 2/2 for 2 resources. You need a blood and a wild threshold. Before those 2 resources, you get an ability that says when a troop enters play under your control, trigger its death cries. Now, that is obviously very powerful in that even without having to put a troop into your crypt, you get the often powerful Deathcry abilities that go with it. Alongside with that, we have Grounds Creeper. Grounds Creeper is a 4/5 with lethal for 5 resources. Again, 1 blood and 1 wild threshold required. But it kind of is the flip side of Lord Blightbark. Now, where Lord Blightbark gives all of your Deathcry triggers on deploy, Grounds Creeper does everything at the end step. So at the end of our turn, we get to trigger all of the Deathcries of a target troop that we control. Now that is insanely powerful with several of the creatures in our deck. And I'm going to go through kind of the core Deathcry, I'll call it the Deathcry suite, as it were. And we're going to start with Naive Lackey here. Naive Lackey is a 0/1, a good blocker for just 1 resource, and it also has that on Deathcry, you draw a card. Now you can use that alongside Takahiro to gain 3 life and draw 2 cards if you sacrifice it, but you can also use it along Lord Blightbark and Grounds Creeper to draw multiple cards a turn. So it even makes this Lackey a decent mid to late game draw where you might think otherwise it might be a throwaway. With either Lord Blightbark or Grounds Creeper in play, you're drawing at least 1 and sometimes 2 cards a turn. So definitely recommend playing the full 4 of in the deck. Beyond that, we have Blight Bush, which is just a value 2 drop that on Deathcry summons 2 Blight Blossoms, and Blight Blossoms are just 1/1s. But again, they are nice blockers against the current aggro-centric meta. It is a good ground pounder. It can be sacrificed in a pinch to make 2 more blockers. And I feel like it's just kind of a necessary inclusion in this deck. Making 2 troops on the fly is a very powerful effect. Now I want to go to what's probably the best Deathcry effect in the deck, and that is with Rune-Ear Hierophant. Now the current gems in Standard allow us to have 2 Deathcry abilities here on our Rune-Ear. The first summons an Abomination with power and toughness equal to Rune-Ear's current power and toughness. And the second, as we just saw, we get to summon a Blight Blossom. So those are the major Blood Orbs of Fleshcraft and the minor Wild Orb of Blossoms. Now this also works very well with Rune-Ear on its own, because if, let's say you have a Lord Blightbark in play, a Rune-Ear can come into play, and you get 3 troops out of the equation. You get a Rune-Ear Hierophant, which would be a 4/4, an Abomination, that would be a 2/2, and a 1/1 Blight Blossom, all for 3 resources. that's very, very powerful. And even on its own, Runear is just one of those really, really good creatures in Standard. So if you're not playing 4 of them, I would recommend you play 4 of them. All right, and finally, we have what I would consider one of the more controversial cards in the deck, and that is Promiscuous Succubus. Now, Promiscuous Succubus doesn't have an immediate Deathcry ability. What it does is on Deathcry, you get to give another troop you control, or even itself in some cases, the ability to summon a Carnal Demon on Deathcry. And Carnal Demon is a 6/6 with Flight. So being able to get those out en masse is obviously very powerful. It takes a little more work to get this going now, but alongside Grounds Creeper and Lord Blightbark, that can happen very quickly. So again, at worst, it's a 3/2 flight troop that is a value blocker, and when it blocks, you can, give somebody the ability to get a Carnal Demon through sacrifice or blocking. And I think that is good enough to at least consider for inclusion in the deck. IceCon played 3 of them. I'm also playing 3 of them. Again, this is the exact same 75. And I actually really like the card in the testing that I've done. Now, some say it just takes a little bit too much work to put together, but I'll let you decide in your own play. Now, I do want to go through a couple really good interactions with the deck. And the first, as I've already mentioned, is Lord Blightbark and Runear Hierophant, with the ability to make those 3 troops for just 3 resources. So you get a 4/4, a 2/2, and a 1/1. Next, I want to talk about Grounds Creeper alongside Promiscuous Succubus. All right, so Grounds Creeper, as we just saw a little bit ago, gives Deathcry effects at the end of turn. Now, if you have both that and Promiscuous Succubus out, at the end step, you can give another troop the ability to make a Carnal Demon. And provided that troop lives, each turn you'll be making a 6/6 with Flight. So in a pinch, do it once, block with it on your opponent's turn, and get a 6/6. In the best case, you leave it out for a few turns and you start making an army. Now that gets even more powerful if you are lucky enough to have Lord Blightbark and Grounds Creeper out at the same time. So whenever Succubus comes into play, give a troop that Deathcry ability, and then at the end step, Grounds Creeper can make that 6/6 demon. And finally, I want to talk about Emperor's Lackey. Now, Emperor's Lackey works with just about everything in our deck. Being able to sacrifice cards on our opponent's turn is extremely important right now. Alongside Promiscuous Succubus, you can make a 6/6 to play around a Lasgar's Vengeance that you might see. Or if you get Clash of Steeled, where otherwise a lot of troops would get voided, you can use Emperor's Lackey to sacrifice all the troops that you need to, and then have those in your crypt to work with, say, Paul of Yazakin or Culmination in Blood. So I think Emperor's Lackey is probably the best 2-drop in our deck, just in terms of raw power, and it gives the flexibility for us to sacrifice our troops whenever we need to. All right, now with this mid-range deck, we also have a very good disruption package. This iteration of Bloodwild Deathcry has opted to not play Underworld Crusader. Now, Underworld Crusader, I will fully admit, is a extremely powerful 3-drop troop in Hex right now. That said, there is a deck building restriction that comes along with it that can often stifle the ability to play multiple removal effects in the deck. So by removing that, we get a little bit more flexibility to give some scattered removal and some more consistent removal. So obviously, if you're playing a blood deck and you have removal, you're probably playing some number of Hero Fall. I play 3 of them, as did Ice. We have a singleton copy of Gruesome Deed. That is just an extra removal effect that allows us to also sacrifice a troop, so that can work well with our Deathcry effects. And beyond that, we have Paul of Yazakin. Now, Paul of Yazakin requires a Scrounge 3, but by doing so, you can get rid of any card on the opposing or on the opponent's battlefield. So against constants, against artifacts, against mysterious runes that might get rune bound, it is a good way to get rid of any of those. All right, and finally in our removal suite, we have a singleton copy of Withering Gaze. Now, you might wonder why there is one Withering Gaze and not just having 4 in the reserves. And that is a nod to the control decks in the format. Diamond Sapphire control is extremely powerful, and Withering Gaze in a pinch can be played to at least see your opponent's hand so you know what you're up against. And in good cases, you can take some of the powerful cards in a Diamond Sapphire control player's deck, mainly Psychic Ascension. So taking that from them, it's usually one of the 2 copies they have, and that can often be backbreaking for the Diamond Sapphire opponent. Otherwise, if you're playing, let's say, against Ruby deck wins or Redlings, you can also potentially snag a Lasgar's Vengeance that might otherwise end the match in their favor. Right? Finally, our removal suite consists of 2 copies of Culmination in Blood. And Culmination of Blood works very well whenever we're putting troops in our crypt to more quickly use this to, basically discard our opponent's hand and keep them without any way to keep up with our threats. So I'm playing 2 Culmination of Blood. I think it's extremely powerful, and I think you should also play 2. All right, moving on to the reserves, we have a lot of one-ofs, and some people say, why all the one-ofs? It seems really inconsistent. Well, I feel like these one-ofs just hedge the matchups that we're a little weak against, while solidifying the matchups that we already feel even or slightly ahead on. For instance, we have 1 copy of Cheap Shot that works against the Ruby deck wins and Redlings decks, and I already feel like we're favored against the aggro decks right now. I feel like we have more ways to block quickly, and Redlings can't really deal with anything above 4 toughness, except for like with the Underworld Crusader. So I feel like having multiple blockers just keeps us in the game against Redlings long enough to really get our Deathcry engine going. All right. We also have the 4th copy of Hero Fall on our board, just for some more consistency against some of those decks that have a lot of 4-ofs. We have a single copy of Lullaby that I bring in against Ruby deck wins to revert Righteous Outlaws, to revert Frothfang Cacklers, and Scapegoats, while preventing a potentially large swing from the Ruby deck wins opponent. We also have the single copy of Misery that works very well against Dreadlings, and more Dreadlings. Also a couple random 1-drops from the Redlings deck, but I mainly just bring this in against Redlings. All right, we have Strangle as another singleton removal spell that can be used in a pinch against like mid-range mirrors or decks to play a lot of things that have under 5 toughness. I'd bring this in against Redlings. I'd bring this in against like a mirror match, and I would bring it in against various blood decks that are roaming around in the format. So it's a very efficient removal spell, but we don't really need too many more than we already have. All right, as we mentioned in the main deck, we have the 1 copy of Withering Gaze in the main deck, and we have 3 more copies in reserves just to hedge our control deck matchup. All right, beyond that, we have 2 copies of Noxious Glory, and Noxious Glory is there solely for the Mono Sapphire Empress matchups. It is extremely good at dealing with the Empress cards, Tribunal Magistrate, Skittering Cultivator, and the namesake card of the deck, Empress of Ice. So I would absolutely bring those in against Empress, and as long as that card is in the meta, I would not keep these out of our reserves. All right, we also have a Gemborn Prowler just as a hedge against some of our Sockets decks and against opposing Runeers and Underworld Crusaders. We have 1 copy of Gargalith to give us a bit of spell shield against the mid-range decks in the format, opposing Hero Falls. In a pinch, it can be used against Transmogrifades and Runebinds. And I like bringing this in against matchups where I can get the full effect of the card. So I like being able to get to a point in the game where I can have 8 resources and play this to its full effect. And finally, we have Waltz of the Damned, which I find is a mid-range backbreaker. It shores up the mirror match, it gives us a ton of advantage, and against opposing Bloodwild Deathcry decks, you can actually use the Deathcry effects that they have in your favor. All right, the only other 2 cards I want to mention are our constant and artifact removal in Rotting Chomp Knight and Scorn of Oberyn. Now, Rotting Chomp Knight can work a little better with our deck in that it has a Deathcry effect, and you can trigger that multiple times in a turn. Along with Lord Blightbark and Grounds Creeper, you can do this multiple times a turn, which is just really powerful against like the Papa Goot decks right now that play Nightfalls, Daybreaks, Twilight Eclipses, and Decree of Banishing even, so you can get some of your troops back. And then Scorn of Oberyn is just 1 more hedge against that as a quick action. So if this happens all of a sudden and you're worried about a constant or an artifact or a troop getting in your way, you can get up to 1 of each of those. And I apologize for the background noise. Some of the traffic in our nearby apartment's a little bit heavy right now, so apologies for that. All right, so that is going to shore up this overview of Bloodwild Deathcry. I have 4 matches lined up for you all, and I hope you'll take the time to watch all 4 of those and have fun. I will see you all for match number 1, and thanks for watching this intro to our Battleshopper breakdown on Bloodwild Deathcry.